Dana. So we'll just keep the recording going, and then Mia can do some editing, post editing. So I think, we're cruising we got a good chunk of time. So I think we're definitely going to split it into 2 episodes. So you did some research in the FODMAP world, as we mentioned, and I will kind of restart a little intro here because we are continuing a recording. If you guys are just tuning in now, there is a part 1 with Dana where we dove into her research on collagen synthesis and her background and her 2 truths and a lie. So if you guys are waiting for the results to that or the answers, you have to listen to part 2 today. So the initial research Dana looked at was in regards to FODMAP and maybe dietary changes, gluten-free diet on GI issues, essentially in athletes. So can you tell us a little bit about maybe what are FODMAPs for our listeners?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. Sometimes when I'm talking to a client, I'm like, oh, should I use the acronym or not? So FODMAPs, I think, the concept of FODMAPs and the understanding of FODMAPs is definitely newer in North America. A lot of the research has come out of Australia and the knowledge around FODMAPs. So FODMAPs is an acronym for fermentable oligo-di-monosaccharides and polyols. So what those are basically groups of short chain carbohydrates that are variably digested and fermented. So in irritable bowel syndrome or some other functional gastrointestinal disorders, sometimes some of these FODMAP foods can exacerbate symptoms or exacerbate how somebody is feeling overall after eating those foods. So the concept of a low FODMAP diet or reducing certain FODMAPs has stemmed originally from clinical research in irritable bowel syndrome.
Okay. I think that's a good breakdown. So what you mentioned, these short chain carbohydrates, what are some examples of like foods that contain these things?
Yeah, probably the most common would be fructans in wheat containing products. So fructans in breads, for example, is one of the most common. And that's where that key link is to the gluten-free diet piece. Sometimes individuals feeling like they have reduced GI symptoms when they eliminate gluten containing foods from their diet. Other foods, and I can get back to that too, because it's a key link between the sort of piece and FODMAPs. But other examples that are common are onions and garlic. So a lot of, if you look at stuff in your cupboard and you look at ingredients of like, let's say pre-mixed rice blends with seasoning, pasta sauce, recipes, onions and garlic are in a lot of things.
Yes.
So when you're looking to, reduce FODMAPs, it's a longer process if you want to go through the whole sort of elimination reintroduction. But sometimes what we do is try to pinpoint what we think the biggest culprits are for somebody who might be susceptible to the effects of FODMAPs in their diet. And these like FODMAPs themselves are in a lot of different foods, but then they're broken down into categories. So we'll have excess fructose, lactose, galactans, fructans, polyols. So all of these are broken up into smaller categories. So it is initially an overwhelming and complicated food system to try to figure out yourself. But Monash University has done an amazing job creating a whole education system, an amazing app to help individuals with irritable bowel syndrome to navigate a low FODMAP diet and also figure out what foods do and do not cause them gastrointestinal or cause increased gastrointestinal distress.
Yeah, I have played around with the Monash app, and it is really neat. I think they do a great job with that, and it's very user friendly. And we can link that in the show notes as well for the listeners if they want to check it out. But so you mentioned FODMAPs being kind of an approach when someone gets diagnosed with IBS. what are symptoms of IBS, or what would someone experience that might lead them to potentially eliminating FODMAPs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the tie between, a clinical condition and some of the gastrointestinal symptoms that athletes experience is an interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
So with irritable bowel syndrome, everyone sort of has their own experience with it, but, diarrhea, bloating, painful bloating, gas, there's can be some upper kind of GI symptoms sometimes too, of just like kind of pressure and, pain, cramping. And there is sort of three different subtypes of IBS. So there's diarrhea predominant, constipation predominant, and then the combo. So, and with, IBS and gastrointestinal symptoms in athletes and non-athletes, they're really transient and they're hard to replicate. So whenever, I'm working with an athlete and trying to figure out, what may be increasing their symptoms, it's a process. It's very rarely just a, one consult, here's your problem. Let's find something to replace that food and go. It's usually, it is a process. And I think that if an athlete is experiencing GI symptoms to the point where it's compromising quality of life or performance, I think it is worth, digging in and trying to go through that process to figure out what the culprits are.
Yeah.
And when we look at, we started looking at FODMAPs in athletes, and we were the first group to start tying some of these pieces together of looking at, okay, we've got that gluten-free diet story. And when people switch to a gluten-free diet, they automatically reduce the fructan load. So when you're going from high fructan intake every day to low or zero, and fructans are the actual compound or the carbohydrate that's causing increased GI symptoms. Subsequently, you just reduce them when you switch to a low FODMAP diet.
Right.
So if you're not aware of that sort of that difference, we weren't at all when we started doing this work. You might think it's gluten. That's you're susceptible to gluten, but really it's these fructans. So that's the sort of tie there with the gluten-free diet. And I mentioned it earlier. I just wanted to make sure that was clear because it's an important concept. And then with athletes, if we look at symptoms of IBS and symptoms of exercise-induced gastrointestinal syndrome in athletes, the symptoms are very, very similar. And I would even say pretty much the same. But the physiology or pathophysiology is different. So with athletes, we know that when you're exercising, blood flow is shunted away from the organs of your splanchnic area, so like stomach, intestines, etc. And it's shunted away to your working muscles. And with that sort of reduced blood flow, you're getting reduced nutrients, reduced oxygen. And that's when that you'll hear like sort of runner's gut or leaky gut. So you're basically with certain durations and intensity of exercise, you're causing gastrointestinal injury, so permeability. And when I look at, endurance athletes, when they're doing, let's say, a 5-hour ride Sunday, Monday might be, a rest day, then Tuesday's hard intervals, Wednesday's a tempo ride. They don't really have the 3 to 4 days needed for epithelial cell healing or turnover.
Wow. Yeah.
They're kind of in a constant state of various levels of gastrointestinal injury. But how serious that is and how, serious the symptoms are really, really varies.
Yeah. I think you brought up the connection with the gluten-free diet and the fructans. When you say fructans, it also makes me think of fructose. So I imagine fructans are prominent in fruits. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah. So some of the fruits that are high in fructans are certain types of apples, persimmons, watermelon. And I'm somebody who would always eat watermelon and get like my stomach would get super, super bloated. I'm like, I just eat watermelon. And then I realized that I was just sort of responding to watermelon.
Interesting.
And then vegetables, asparagus, beetroot, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, fennel, garlic, leeks are some of them, onion. And then spring onion and the green parts of, those long green onions.
Yes.
So the white part at the bottom is
interesting.
where the fructans are.
Wow.
So you can still use them. You just got to just use the greens.
Yeah. Interesting. So fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So you did some research in that area, looking at whether removing gluten from the diet helped minimize GI issues. Could you kind of share that research with us?
Yeah, we ran again like a double-blind crossover study where we measured packed, cooked all the food that the subjects ate. So we were able to control the FODMAP content and also the gluten content. So it was basically, we were able to eliminate the gluten and just have a certain load of FODMAP. So low FODMAP was less than 0.5 grams of FODMAPs per meal. And then the high FODMAP was over that. And I think it was 10 plus. No, sorry. I'm trying to remember the numbers. It was so long ago now. I'd have to go back to the
we'll link it.
Remember the exact FODMAP content, but basically high and low.
Yeah.
And subjects did a crossover study. So they did 6 days of each and replicated exercise. And we recorded gastrointestinal symptom severity with a self-reported questionnaire. And we're able to sort of quantify whether or not a low FODMAP diet in athletes that tended to get, so we did with our intake, subjects needed to have, report a certain level of gastrointestinal symptoms with exercise. So our subjects were subjects that were susceptible to exercise related GI symptoms. So with that study, we did find a significant decrease in gastrointestinal symptoms during exercise and certain exercise bouts, and also outside of exercise in some subjects. So with that study, it was the first study to actually explore this. So, we learned a lot from the study itself, but it was a pretty big turning point for realizing that this clinical diet that we have quite a bit of knowledge on at this point may actually play a role in reducing gastrointestinal symptoms in athletes. So since then, Monash University has gone full gas with running some really, really comprehensive, amazing studies in looking at FODMAP modification in athletes.
Wow.
And also have done an amazing job with really setting up the standards for that type of research, for gastrointestinal research, with to just make sure that, the prescribed exercise is enough to stimulate GI symptoms. And just looking at, controlling FODMAP level before the study, and a lot of little nuances that we've come a long way in understanding this area, and also just, designing research that is essentially well controlled. Yeah. And even though, a lot of our listeners aren't going to be running, FODMAP research, I think even looking through some of that research is really helpful from a practical perspective. If you're really trying to break down and find, an athlete's best race day nutrition and, reduce gastrointestinal symptoms compromising performance, some of those clinical standards for research, I also pull into practice, into athlete strategy.
Awesome. So with that study you mentioned, out of curiosity, I know many times with endurance athletes, like you're saying, if we're doing even if you're doing like an ultra marathon or something like that, but if you're doing some long duration stuff, and I definitely see more GI issues for sure in my runners and my cyclists, but I can see it in my cyclists as well. There's that suggestion of limiting fiber maybe in the 24 hours before. With your study limiting the FODMAP content, did you also check how much total fiber was there? Was it also a lowering of total fiber, or were they consuming similar amounts of fiber across groups? You recall?
Yeah, fantastic question. So the fiber was similar across all groups. The only thing we were unable to measure, just because it was not possible, was resistant starch. So there are factors that, can't totally measure. But fiber was similar across. And before, even if I'm working with an athlete and we're trying to figure out what's causing GI symptoms, you know, we know that there's a physiological component. We know that there's a gut-brain connection component. And then when you're looking at, you know, dietary modification, I still rarely will start with looking at FODMAPs unless it's really evident that they're eating, you know, like a whole watermelon the day before or something that, you know, we know is very high in FODMAPs. Unless it jumps out and kicks me in the face, you still do start with the low hanging fruit. Looking at fiber intake, protein intake, timing of food, hydration, and, you know, training the gut and training race day nutrition is also an important piece, because sometimes you'll have clients and athletes you work with that really only get GI symptoms on race day. But they also eat way more carbohydrate on race day than they usually do.
Or use a product they've never tried before.
Exactly. It's on the course. So I always encourage athletes to check out what's going to be at the feed zone if they aren't in control of their feeds.
Definitely. So kind of touching on the FODMAPs and GI issues in kind of endurance athletes, if someone is starting to kind of consider that approach, maybe they've already extremely limited their fiber intake. You mentioned kind of primary big hitters are garlic, onion, and I forget what the other one was that you said in the beginning.
Garlic, onion is usually almost everything.
Okay.
Some fruits, apples are one, pears.
Apples, that's right. Yeah. So minimizing likely those things, obviously, in the day before as well, even though they don't necessarily, if someone's using garlic, it's probably not contributing so much fiber necessarily, but they should still avoid it and limit it potentially in that day before, would you say, if they're trying to see if they have issues or not?
Yeah, I usually, with looking at if FODMAP modification has any sort of beneficial impact, again, starting with the low-hanging fruit, but then I also, the FODMAP diet piece is pretty complex, and I'm always conscientious about athletes unnecessarily restricting foods. So in an ideal world, an athlete deciding to try a FODMAP modification works with a practitioner who's actually been certified through the FODMAP training course. So that course it's available online, but I mean, sometimes we, as a practitioner, we're like, no, I can do the research and read, and then I should get the knowledge I need. In some cases, that definitely is totally the way to go. But I am a proponent of the Monash FODMAP course. I don't get any kickbacks. I just learned a lot from it, even though I had already, finished PhD work in this area. There's just some nuances. Totally. Just will not learn unless you do that course. So I mean, if you're working more in a clinical setting, I think that course is really essential. If you're working in an athlete setting, I think it's case to case. I think there are some scenarios where you're really not digging into some of the nuances. But if you do have an athlete who wants to see if FODMAPs are affecting them, I would look at their diet first and just kind of get a feel of just looking at it, you kind of have an idea of what high FODMAP foods that they're eating and how much. And athletes tend to be creatures of habit. So even if you get a 1 or 2 day quick food recall just to pinpoint foods that may be culprits, sometimes you can just say, okay, I think these are the culprits. Why don't we substitute something else in for these FODMAP foods that is low FODMAP option, and let's try it for a race or a training day. You know, ideally, we don't want to try new things before a race, but in a scenario where an athlete's only getting issues on race day, I think that, swapping up some foods, I don't think that's a huge high risk. But if I had an athlete who's, racing every weekend and they're getting a lot of GI symptoms every weekend, and then also, kind of GI issues after racing the next day, where food absorption still may not be great, and we really nutrients to be absorbed well to optimize recovery, I might then go down the road of doing a full low FODMAP elimination and reintroduction. And that's something I would work with a practitioner on for sure. And that can be a long process, 6-8 weeks. And then the reintroduction piece is very, very individualized. And sometimes you can reintroduce a certain amount, and that, let's say, I don't know, a quarter of an avocado, and that's fine, but then half an avocado is too much. So you can get very, very detailed, nuanced. I would say in athletes, I very rarely have had to go through a really, really long reintroduction.
Mm-hmm.
We usually find a few foods, find those substitutes, and they're good to go.
That's great. So kind of thinking about the process through the digestive system, why are these FODMAPs, why are they problematic? Is the gut bacteria just having a party breaking those things down? Or what's the process of that kind of fiber source, or fructin as an example, going through the system, and why is it causing that person issues?
Yeah, it is basically a fermentation party. I think only dietitians may think that's funny.
Yeah.
But so these are basically short chain carbohydrates that are generally across everyone, all humans, they're variably absorbed. So they're not fully digested and absorbed. So when something is not fully absorbed, it's sitting inside, the lumen of the small intestine. And the first sort of physiological thing that happens is with that difference in osmotic gradient, sometimes water can get pulled, or fluids are pulled into that really concentrated area of where the short chain carbohydrates are sitting. So there's that osmotic piece, and that can cause kind of, like sloshing, and diarrhea. But the bigger sort of factor is when those short chain carbohydrates transit down to the lower GI, and they are fermented. And with fermentation, gas is produced. So that's where you might get, the really painful bloating that can contribute to diarrhea as well, and just kind of like that whole gut diarrhea, bloating. So that's what's happening with that process with FODMAPs.
Interesting. Do you think, or have you seen any research that suggests changing the microbiome structure, or kind of with the Monash app, kind of like slower incremental increases in portion sizes of maybe certain things that are triggering? Does that then increase the gut microbiome that can help maybe break that thing down in a less gas producing way? Or can we kind of start to consume things over time, or do we fully have to eliminate these things for the rest of our lives?
Yeah, what's great is the gut is actually pretty adaptable. So, you can change and alter your microbiome. So the population and the density and the diversity, you can modify that pretty rapidly. And there's a lot of different factors that influence your gut microbiome. What's interesting is the gut is very adaptive. So we know that gut microbiome density and composition or diversity can change with the food you eat, the environment you're in, stress, exercise, intensity of exercise. So there's a lot of different factors that can influence your gut microbiome. And what the reintroduction phase of a low FODMAP diet intends to do is, if there's foods that you really want to have in your diet, or you want to reduce unnecessary restriction as much as possible, there is a process that you can sort of feed little amounts and hopefully improve your gut's ability to process, digest, and absorb different carbohydrates. The risk with a low FODMAP diet, though, if you're on a strict low FODMAP diet for a long period of time, is it actually has been shown to compromise the amount of some of the healthier gut microbiome factors. Yeah, so a study done earlier on with Monash showed that a strict low FODMAP diet did reduce the population density of a certain bacillus, and then feeding that supplement back into the subjects with the low FODMAP diet reversed the decrease that was observed. So if somebody absolutely needs to be on a strict low FODMAP diet, taking some probiotics as a supplement, or even things like a non-lactose containing kefir, can slow down or reduce that negative impact on the gut microbiome.
Yeah, the microbiome is so fascinating. Just like all the stuff. I think that will be an area of research that is just like constantly producing new pieces of literature, because it's just there's so much going on in there that we still don't know from a microbiome perspective. But I think you make a good point there, is trying to kind of eliminate these things for forever is you are compromising that gut microbiome. And we know that the microbiome plays many parts into our health. And so if we're compromising that, we gotta make it kind of set it back up for a good place, whether that's, for digestive purposes, but immune health, you name it.
And I still, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Jump in with one thing. I think, with the focus on sort of athletes, mental health and psychological well-being, I also when you look as a practitioner and as somebody working in sport to help athletes, you really have to look at the sort of holistic picture. So I think sometimes we get sucked in, we want to improve this performance parameter, or we want to improve gut health. But I've definitely in my practice, as you're working with, in a holistic approach of even looking at how the gut microbiome affects mental health. And that's something too, just kind of coming out of the last couple of years, everyone has been more aware of. Yeah. So as, sort of how I work with athletes too, the gut piece is always involved. Yeah. In some capacity or another.
That's great. So talking about kind of gut health, what are some of the things maybe you would suggest for an athlete who, when we think about like the example you gave where someone's regularly doing some stress to the gut or like causing a lack of blood flow to that GI, what are some things someone could do to kind of make the healthiest gut
healthiest athletic gut possible?
Yeah.
Well, we know that if you have an athlete, they are doing the sort of exercise piece that improves the gut microbiota. The moderate exercise so far has been shown to be essentially the best for improving gut microbiome. Intense exercise can compromise, but it's always, it's always a balance, and there's always adaptation. Right. So I'm always hesitant to say this happens in the, general population. So we got to be careful that this doesn't happen in an athlete. There are different adaptations. Yeah. So I think, and your gut, as I mentioned, is quite adaptable. So there is also an adaptation to the reduced blood flow. So the sort of downstream repercussions aren't as severe eventually. Oh, okay. So there's that, natural adaptation. But I look at the, the full diet, the full nutrition strategy of an athlete. And if I'm focusing just on the gut, I usually try to make sure that there is, one sort of what we would consider like a gut healthy food per meal. So like a food high in probiotics and prebiotic fibers. So I would look across, what are their usual strategies, their habits, and then try to make sure that the gut healthy foods are part of their everyday strategy. And one thing I usually recommend to athletes who like the taste is wake up in the morning and have kefir. I just think it's it's super, super rich in probiotics. And then on an empty stomach, it's like you're starting your day, getting some probiotics going in there, then have your breakfast. Yeah, that's usually sort of an easy strategy that an athlete can like tick off. So try to have strategies that are, they don't have to really think every time they eat too much. It's just like, okay, if you're at home, have kimchi in the fridge, have a couple, 4 bowls of kimchi, have kefir in the morning, have your snack. So those types of easy strategies to just sort of improve the gut environment as much as possible. I also look at sort of stress and how an athlete is managing their stress, because I think that also plays a role in symptom severity. Look at a history, look at blood work. So if we do see, iron deficiency, and, we're able to, I usually, if some things point towards, doing a celiac screen, you don't want to overlook any underlying etiologies. So if there, is a rationale for maybe something more clinical going on, I think it's important to make sure that that's not overlooked. And then, once you've gone through all the low hanging fruit, figuring out, what sessions gastrointestinal symptoms are more severe, or if the day-to-day symptoms are more of the issue, figuring out, what foods could be triggering,
Mm-hmm.
starting with the low-hanging fruit,
Mm-hmm.
and building up as we scratch off strategies in a very systematic way. And then getting more into the specific FODMAPs that could be triggering or making symptoms feel more severe.
Yeah.
And then I try to use like tools that are less subjective. So on the Monash app, there is a Likert sliding scale for symptom severity and upper lower symptoms. So I'll often use that and try to get athletes to track. I'm conscientious about how much I ask an athlete to do on an app, because we're all on our phones too much. So I'll only really use that if I feel it's necessary. We're trying to have a way to measure improvement rather than, kind of just asking, because there's so many factors that influence how you feel. And sometimes you're relying on recollection. So I usually try to use something that will give me a clear measurement and is validated. And then basically figuring out, okay, if we have eventually pinpointed the exact foods that increase GI symptoms, then removing those from the diet, but making sure that we have substituted. So I always try to use the word substitution rather than eliminate, reduce, cut out. We're going to substitute, a low FODMAP alternative. And that also reduces the risk of inadvertently restricting food or, not meeting carbohydrate needs or energy needs because you've cut out all these foods. And sometimes when an athlete's traveling and, sometimes they aren't that much of a planner, they could end up just inadvertently not fueling enough as well. Yeah.
I think those are all great tips. That kind of leads me to, and this might be the similar suggestion as well that you have, but it makes me think too of an athlete an endurance athlete, maybe when they get to that peak event, and maybe it's a 6-hour bike race, maybe it's a 24-hour ultra marathon, and there's like a severe lack of appetite post and maybe even nausea and stuff like that. Is there a progression, maybe that through the days following that event, that one should consider in terms of like trying to get the gut back into a functioning place?
Yeah. When there is an event where we know that there's going to be a significant amount of gut damage, and we can with blood work we can measure that damage, and in studies we can measure that damage, but we know that certain exercise bouts and intensity will cause an increase in epithelial permeability, epithelial cell damage. And so when we know that that's happened, and nutrient absorption may be compromised during a period when we want nutrient absorption to be really high, because we want to recover, we want to get all those micronutrients, macronutrients in and doing their thing. I usually try to, sometimes we'll do more liquid nutrition. So if the appetite or nausea is a case, sometimes we'll do liquid nutrition and try to make, these super smoothies with just super nutrient dense foods. That would be the sort of first strategy. Sometimes if we know that an athlete maybe is lactose intolerant, or lactose is causing symptoms, we might find an alternative for lactose in the days following. Because if you're eating foods that are then going to cause more diarrhea for yourself, you're further sort of exacerbating how fast nutrients are transporting through your GI symptoms and the opportunity to absorb that food. So depending, I guess, on the sort of symptoms they're getting, I might add more fiber in some cases, slow digestion down if there's a lot of diarrhea. And then also just, all the gut healthy foods that, essentially are tolerated. And then also just making sure that energy availability is balanced, and all the sort of the foundational pieces to optimizing recovery. And then sort of small bits of fueling throughout the day too. So break it up that you're having small bits, rather than, your classic 3 meals and 2 snacks or whatever, but sometimes you just might end up eating, a little bit every hour or every 2 hours. And also probably a good protein feed before bed. We know that eating protein before bed improves overnight synthesis. So, we're looking at healing, muscle tissue, but also, epithelial lining and those cells in that tissue. So I think so just doing everything we can for tissue repair and recovery.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that those are all excellent suggestions. And let's see, we've had you here for quite a while, so I do want to be mindful of your time. For our listeners, we are recording part 2, but we just kept cruising through because Dana is a wealth of information. So any other FODMAP nuggets that you want to share with us?
Yeah, I probably would just reiterate that I would avoid jumping on the FODMAP bandwagon. I think it really is an interesting area. I think it is a very effective strategy for reducing gastrointestinal symptoms in athletes, during, strenuous events. But I would avoid sort of over restricting and work with somebody who has the knowledge, but or has gone through, a proper training course before you start kind of grabbing ideas anywhere and everywhere, because there's just a lot of nuances to this diet or to modifying FODMAP intake. And, I would hate for an athlete to actually make problems worse.
Yeah.
So I'd say, definitely be systematic. Don't jump on the bandwagon, figure out your body and what's working for your body in a very systematic way. And bring on a professional.
Right. I agree. And so one thing too, I took away from that is, if we're not going to we really shouldn't be eliminating these things completely 24/7, that if anything, maybe it's eliminated or minimized in the days leading up to a key event potentially, but outside of that, trying to implement it to help kind of bring that back.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if you're going to do like a strict low FODMAP, eliminating in the, 24 hours before an event, fine, not a high risk if you're not competing every weekend, et cetera. But also if you're, even if you're somebody who's like, you haven't eaten a food in a while, and then you all of a sudden have it, sometimes your gut in a way reverse adapts. So cutting out foods a lot and cutting out more than you need, you could possibly be increasing your intolerance. So I think it is important to have as much variety as possible. So, athletes who a lot are creatures of habit and busy people with training and sometimes working, et cetera. We do become creatures of habit, but I would definitely stress trying to eat as much variety as possible. And again, reducing restriction as much as possible.
Yeah, I love that. So if you guys have been hanging on for the listeners for Dana's 2 truths and a lie reveal, we're going to reveal it now. So Dana told us in our part 1 that she either personally rebuilt a Volkswagen bus. Her first career was to become a mountain guide, and she skied in the Himalayas. So which one is your lie?
It's the last one. I have skied in the Himalayas. Skied in a lot of places, but haven't quite made it out to the Himalayas yet.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So I get a little bonus tick on that one over Nia, I think, today.
And I'll send you pictures of our bus. Her name is Carrie Blast. It's a brutal name.
Oh my goodness. That's amazing. I mean, yes, I definitely want to see pictures of that bus. That's so cool. Did you do any mountain guide stuff in your early career?
Yeah, I initially went to school for outdoor recreation management.
Cool.
So I went to Capilano University in North Vancouver.
Wow.
And was sort of on the pathway. I worked for Outward Bound as an instructor.
Oh, nice.
Worked for Youth Challenge International, which was sort of a global development organization in Costa Rica. So sort of that outdoor leadership piece was just something that I, absolutely fell in love with. But and then started apprenticing to be a rock guide, and had the mountain guide piece out. But it's a lifestyle that you're. The stability is questionable. So I think long-term, getting into science and challenging myself in a more academic manner was a good move at that point.
Awesome. Yes, that's very cool. So where can people find you?
So here's my accountability to everybody who's listening. So I am a colleague of mine and myself are starting a sort of new performance nutrition mentorship. Program, group coaching. So we're building it right now. So I'm telling everyone right now, I'm going to become very active on social media.
All right.
It's not something that I am super passionate about, but I do understand the power and the need for it. So I'm at Summit Fuel for Twitter and Instagram, I think is the same.
Okay. Awesome. We'll double check.
But those, and then I have my website, my personal website, which is Summit Sports Nutrition.
Awesome.
And then, yeah, keep your eyes peeled for Performance Nutrition Professionals, our new
I love it.
coaching program that we should launch in January.
Amazing. So would that be something like myself could take a class or a course?
Yeah,
Very cool.
absolutely. We're sort of, really trying to close a gap. Both of us have worked quite internationally and been able to, see how different countries and different sports systems work, and how nutrition is integrated and, what works, what doesn't. So trying to, bring some of that international insight to, the North American field.
Awesome. Amazing. Well, I definitely loved having you on. Totally was able to geek out and pick your brain, which was wonderful. So I super appreciate your time for doing 2 podcasts with us. So yes,
my mouth's a little dry now.
It's all good. It's all good. So hopefully the listeners got the good fill, but of all their information and useful nuggets, I'm sure. And thank you again so much for your time, Dana.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. You guys have done a fantastic job with the podcast, and I was been scrolling it a bit the last couple of weeks, and huge diversity in speakers. So kudos to that. I find with sometimes nutrition podcasts, it's the same people over and over again. I'm like, oh, boring. But you guys have such diverse speakers, and keep that up. It's awesome.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.